This is Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for the class POLI 201, American National Government. This is part of an ongoing set of lectures that I've done for the class. And this particular lecture is on the question of political parties, the overview and function of American political parties. And as we remember from this class, the point of this lecture is to discuss the ways in which the party system in the United States serves as a mediating institution between the citizens and the government. And if there is one mediating institution, there are other mediating institutions, of course, like literally the media, other mediating institutions such as interest groups, but there is no more powerful and central mediating institutions than political parties themselves. All right, so what we'll do in this lecture is talk about the two-party system in various ways. And with today's topic, I want to just give a broad overview to talk about what are the functions of political parties, what do they do, how do we define them, and then I want to discuss what has been called for more than 100 years now, the responsible party model. And we'll discuss this ideal type of the responsible party in a democratic society and how far, in some respects, political parties today and how they actually function may deviate from that responsible party model. Okay. Now, I want the class to read the two pieces that are from two scholars that have discussed a fundamental problem. And as part of the opening story for this section, the fundamental problem we're talking about is political polarization, or how there is such a great divide between political parties or between citizens within a society. There's such a great divide that makes it very difficult to solve the collective action problem, to come together to collectively act, to collectively solve societal and various political problems through legislation and through policy. And two scholars that we're reading are from Morris Fiorina, distinguished professor at the University of Syracuse University, who argues that political polarization is important. It serves as a function. It helps to make distinctions between the political parties. It gives us a way in which we can have strong brands that people can identify with. And so he kind of challenges the notion that polarization in and of itself is a bad thing. On the other side is Professor Alan Abramowitz at Emory University, who argues no, political polarization is a bad thing. It does provide some real difficulties in moving things forward. You can't get legislation through Congress. There's gridlock. All of these issues confront us with the issue of political polarization. And so I ask the question, are ordinary American citizens as deeply divided as are the political parties? Is it the political parties that are dividing the people, or the people divided, and thus that's reflected in the political parties? Which way does that arrow go? Which way, as we say in political and social science, in what direction does that causal arrow point? And does this division confuse us, or does it help to clarify our politics? Okay. All right. Now, I'm presenting parts of this lecture, of course, in class, but I want to present something I didn't present in class, which is sort of a short video that talks about political polarization. It's from the BBC News. So let me click on this YouTube link for that purpose.
absolutely key. What happens if you want to buy a house? That can be a big...
So if you watch TV, or read the paper, or check out the old Twitter, the growing political polarization in America is hard to ignore.
Okay, let me do that again.
So if you watch TV, or read the paper, or check out the old Twitter, the growing political polarization in America is hard to ignore. Well, now, new polling data by the Pew Research Center confirms just how extreme the gap is. The story starts with this rocky-looking thing, which is actually a snapshot of 1994. It's the distribution of political views. Here, at the highest middle point, we see that 49% of Americans held mixed political views. Now, forward we go to 2014, where that middle of mixed views has shrunk, and the number of steadfast liberals and conservatives has increased. Okay, let's see that change again. Now, Democrats and Republicans have always butted heads, but more and more the disagreement is turning pretty dark. Here's the changing percentage of each party viewing those in the other party as very unfavorable. Now, in 2014, there's also a good chunk who think the other party is actually a threat to the nation's well-being. What's interesting is that this polarization isn't just about politics, it's about a way of life. Pew Research surveyed people to see if they'd rather live in big houses and a spread-out community, or a place with smaller houses and more walkable. The answers of people with mixed political views were about a 50-50 split. But look at the split in preferences between people Pew Research identified as strong liberals and strong conservatives. Overall, Americans are more likely to hold mixed political views. But it's those with mixed political views that are also the least likely to cast a vote. David Botti, BBC News, Washington.
Okay, so to get back to our story. So you can see that this question of polarization is so deep in some respects that it is about divides in our thinking and our preferred lifestyles. And this is the graphical image that I'm presenting in class as part of our discussion about polarization in Congress. It's a graphical representation of just how far apart are various members of Congress if we are to use big data sets like the Nominate data set, which is a huge data set that records and I think Nominate goes all the way back, conceivably to 1790, but goes back all the way to record nearly every vote of a member of Congress in Congress and maps out the ideological divides. And so essentially this is a spatial representation of the views of members of Congress over the last several Congresses. And you can see that the clouds start closely together, the blue cloud and the red cloud, blue for Democrat, red for Republican, are sometimes meshed together to form purple areas. But as you go along, these clouds begin to separate from each other, literally separate from each other. And here's the further sort of static representation of that, where you start in 1967, you have some areas of gray where or some areas where the dots overlap between each other, or at least are closely together. In 1967, true of 1969, true of 1971. You even have some mixtures where the blue dots are sort of meshing over on the red side over on the blue side. But you get to the 2000s, and these are really distinct clouds. There's clouds literally in different parts of the sky. So the blue cloud is really distinct. You have one little outlier here, but really distinct from the red cloud. Blue cloud, really distinct from the red cloud. Then by 2011, the red cloud was larger, a larger majority in the House, among Republicans, and the blue cloud is still very distinct. Just a few stray little blue dots, quote unquote, stray little blue dots over here. So there literally is, you can literally see, you're not seeing things. It literally is polarization in Congress. And this polarization in Congress is reflected also in the party divides among the people. And so the opinions of those who self-identify as Democrats are on the left side here, and this is referring to that Pew Research Center study that the video clip just showed you. The Pew Research Center maps out the ways in which you see Democratic opinion being more consistently liberal, so Democrats more identifying as mostly liberal, or more strongly liberal, consistently liberal, though they are becoming more, not only more, a little more partisan, but a little bit more ideologically liberal. And Republicans are becoming more ideologically conservative. Although they dipped down a little bit here, it rebounded by 2014 when you compare 2014 to 1997. Again, more mostly conservative, of course, consistently conservative. Okay, so we'll come back to this point, as I said, but the polarization that has occurred in Congress mirrors what's found in the public. And is that a problem? Is polarization a problem? Does it pose a problem for the collective action problem? And so the principles of politics I want us to focus on in this section are the institutional question, or the institutional principle, and what I'm doing in each of these bullet points is consolidating some broader points that the authors make in the textbook. So the institutional problem: political parties are teams of politicians, activists, and interest groups organized to win control of government. Political parties have their formal leaders, but there also are party activists. So the formal leaders of the party, Barack Obama as president of the United States, was head of the Democratic Party for all intents and purposes. Donald Trump as the president of the United States is the head of the Republican Party, the chief leader, even though you have a party chair. The president sets the tone for the party, being the chief executive and member of that party. So they among many others are sort of formal leaders within the party. But then you have party activists, folk who may or may not directly align with the party or say they're members of the party, but are trying to push the party. Examples we can give might be, sort of the controversial figure of Steve Bannon on the right, who in some ways, some even, argue about, how attached is Steve Bannon to the Republican Party. Well, Steve Bannon is certainly trying to push the party in certain directions that he thinks align with the agenda of President Trump. On the left side, someone like a Reverend Al Sharpton, who has pushed the party from the left, or Reverend Jesse Jackson, who pushed the party on the left, the Democratic Party on the left, aren't formal party leaders, but are certainly individuals who try to activate and mobilize the base, and get folk to push certain policy questions and stances on the left. So those are the activists, and then you sort of have a range of interest groups. The NRA on the right with the Republicans, labor unions, the National Rifle Association on the right with Republicans. Then you have on the left groups like labor unions for the Democratic Party. So they do all this to try to organize and win control of government. The U.S. has a two-party system. Now, this two-party system is a consequence of our form of government. We have a presidential form, not a parliamentary form of government. It's the result of our election laws and the use of single-member legislative districts, where we don't elect several persons on a party slate when we go into the voting booth. We are electing, two senators, or more importantly, as we get down to Congress and the House, we're electing one representative. No matter how many people are on the ballot and how many. Even if someone doesn't get a majority, as long as they get the highest number of votes, that winner takes all. And he or she is a single member that we elect to that district. If we elected more than one person from more than one party, then that would not reinforce the two-party system in the way that the single member district does. Then the rationality and collective action problems or principles come into play, and I've kind of mixed them together. But parties help solve the information problem for voters. They offer distinctive brands and simplified choices, as well as aggregate and organize interest, so to mobilize for candidates and policies in and outside of government, and them overcoming this collective action problem, providing brands. I can go to the voting booth and say, hey, I'm a Republican, I'll vote. I don't know much about this woman who's on the ballot, this person who's on the ballot, but I'm going to vote for her because she's a Republican. Or, hey, I'm a Democrat. I don't know much about this guy who's on the ballot, but he's a Democrat. I'll vote for him. So they provide cues that voters use in understanding how to cast what they think is a meaningful vote. And they, as I say, aggregate and organize interest to mobilize for candidates and policies. Okay, that's enough, but those are important discussions and overviews of the principles of politics. So, what is a political party? A political party is a group that does several things. First of all, it's a group that attempts to influence government by electing its members to office. And it uses both ideology or ideological cues as well as party platforms to solve the information problem for voters and to have them cast meaningful votes. Votes that they think, where they think their preferences, what they prefer, can be represented in government. Political parties also unite officials at various levels of government, or what may be called party unity or party discipline. So if I elect a member of a political party to represent me in Congress, but that person doesn't talk with other members of Congress of similar mind, of similar, not of just similar background, but of similar policy stances, they can't form coalitions to pass legislation. And so being able to use party as a means to organize that process and to overcome the collective action problem is critically important. Then they also organize electoral participation. Parties provide voters with choices on the ballot, and they give us cues as to how to, not only do they give us cues, but they go out and mobilize individuals. Parties go out and outreach to convince people to vote. They try to register individuals to vote. So organizing that electoral participation, mobilizing, getting people out, campaigning is critically important as a party function. And there are, of course, a difference between party in government, party in the electorate, and party identification. Party in government, as I'll explain in just a moment, but real quickly, party in government meaning who are those leaders who are elected to the halls of government, whether it be Congress or a state legislature or a county board or county commission. They are elected to be, particularly if they are elected on partisan ballots, they're elected to represent in government and to coalesce within government. Party in the electorate. In what ways do the political parties come, of course, and candidates have to come outside the halls of government. They have to go into communities, into churches and other places to make an appeal to people to vote. Party identification is to what degree the people have an identification with a political party, as you can just imagine, it's sort of self-explanatory, but have an identification with a political party based upon these appeals. Now, what is the difference between party leaders, party activists, and a party supporter? Party leaders are those who are directly elected into positions within the party, or they're persons in government who embrace party labels. So those are party leaders. Party leaders are the folk who are formerly in government who embrace the party label. I am a member of the Senate, but I'm a Republican. That's a party leader. They certainly play an important role in shaping the party processes and the party's platform. Party activists, again, are those persons who may not have a formal label, but they push the party, as I explained earlier, and they don't and they push the party from on the outside. And then party supporters are simply those within, the broad public that either have this partisan identification, identify with the party, or don't identify with the party. Now, it is arguable that representative democracy is difficult, some would even say impossible, without political parties. George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation as the first president of the United States, warned against, Washington warned against factions, and in particular, Washington was leery, I should say, of political parties. But even given Washington's wisdom, it's hard to conceive of how you move government and how you overcome the collective action problem in a democratic society without some notion of party or party labels. We can discuss this further, but I think that point is important to raise. Here is a chart that from the book that talks about Americans' party identification. And there's a slight break in the line given the source that they're using from the Pew Research Center. But it goes from 1939 all the way up to 2016. And you can see that this is a result of the New Deal, of Roosevelt's New Deal, where the Democrats were clearly the dominant party in the United States, because the identification with the Democratic Party, both in parts of the South as well as parts of the Northeast and West, were pretty solid, very solid, and the Democrats literally became the majority party by sort of the beginning of the 1960s. But then slowly, particularly and we'll talk about this, especially with Nixon's Southern strategy, the Republican Party began to increase in identification as the Democratic Party became down. And by this period now in 2016, where you have the highest level of identification are, again, folks with mixed views, independents, people who don't embrace a party label. Democrats coming in second and Republicans coming in third. And this is interesting. This is interesting because right now Republicans, by the party in the electorate, is the dominant party. The Republicans holding the presidency in both houses of Congress, as well as a majority of governorships and a majority of seats in state legislatures. But independents and Democrats are within the electorate I won't say dominant, but are the parties with a greater plurality of identification. So this is an interesting contrast of times that we live in. Now, I want to talk about in what ways we came to this clarifying moment. There are a lot of things that we can look at. And when I say clarifying moment, how do we get to this point of political polarization? Or we can look at it from the standpoint of how do we get to the moment where political parties greatly clarified, if you will, what their brands were. It was, this is what it means to be a Republican. This is solidly what it means to be a Democrat. One argument that two scholars, Carmeans and Stimpson, made in the late 80s into the 90s, spoke about in what ways civil rights, questions on civil rights and on ethnic and racial policy in the United States helped to bring about a clarification among the parties. And that in their analysis, they demonstrate that after 1964, both by party in government and party in the electorate, Democrats became racial liberals and Republicans became racial conservatives. Southern defection to the Republican Party. So on questions of civil rights policy, that's just one, but it's a very important point of clarification of how the parties began to sort themselves out in very distinct ways. And so this particular chart shows the voting patterns of members of the U.S. Senate, and it goes from those with a high level of liberalism to lower levels of liberalism. So this is a liberalism scale across, and so 80 would be very liberal, and then 20 would be more conservative as you go down the scale. Here's the pattern among Republicans. So in the 1940s, Republicans were more likely to be liberal on civil rights policy than Democrats. Why? Because in the South was a party that was solidly Democratic. But the South was also a region that in this period embraced at the local and state government levels, embraced racial segregation as official policy, Jim Crow policy. And so Southern Democrats they may have been with Roosevelt economically, but on civil rights and aspects of that social policy, they were conservatives. And Republicans, particularly in the Northeast and in the Midwest, were more racial liberals. So you have this interesting way in which between the 1940s into the 1960s, particularly with the ways in which you had individuals like a Strom Thurmond, who was a Southern Democrat, but then he led what was called the Dixiecrat Party, or the Dixiecrat, or what were labeled, I should say. So the Dixiecrat move of moving and resisting on civil rights policy, resisting Harry Truman, particularly in the 1948 election. So you had these Southern Democrats begin to move to the Republican Party, and so the parties then split. And by 1980, they were in the Senate in particular, they were exactly the opposite poles between the parties. And the Democrats more racially liberal, the Republicans more racially conservative. A similar pattern was true in the House, and a similar clarifying pattern became true in the House. A little more bumpy here in the middle, but certainly by the 1980s, it had clarified and the parties had switched. And this is racial liberalism among Democratic and Republican Party identifiers. So this is within the electorate. And you had some degree of certainly liberalism. These lines were closer together, but you had some degree of liberalism among Democrats in 1945, a little less liberalism among Republicans. They shot up, but then it shot back down, and they were really clarified by the 1980s. So you can see how those lines move consistently they moved in the same direction for both of these political parties. All right. And what was it? Whether we're talking about the program, the civil rights program of John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Baines Johnson, the ways Johnson said in the 1964 election that after he passed landmark civil rights legislation and would pass voting rights legislation, he says, we've just lost the South for a generation. Unfortunately, Johnson, he was optimistic because the Democrats lost the South for even longer than a generation in that sense. But certainly civil rights policy was a spur to create this point of clarification among the parties. And as I said, Nixon's Southern strategy, the 1968 Southern strategy. What was the Southern strategy? Well, Richard Milhouse Nixon, Republican president, said, well, what we're going to do is moderate on civil rights policy, moderate on school desegregation and busing, so we can appeal to the suburban voter and we can appeal to the Southern voter to come into the Republican Party as the party that's more moderate or more conservative on civil rights policy. And that helped to bring about some clarification of the brands, if you will. And certainly by 1972, with Nixon and Humphrey, where Hubert Humphrey was very much a strong civil rights liberal. Nixon was certainly more of a moderate to conservative on civil rights policy, go slow. Not completely. Nixon actually was supportive of some aspects of affirmative action, but for the time he was more of a moderate or conservative. And so by that time, we clearly saw that their appeals were reaching toward distinct. We're looking at distinctions in voters that began to really stick from this period forward. All right, that's I know this is a long discussion, but I wanted to give you some sense of, well, how did we get to this moment? That's one way we got to this moment. we also got to this moment by way of religiosity, of age, of just sort of lifestyle in some broader respect. And sort of region also plays into this, the South versus the Northeast and Midwest. So these are other factors that sort of coincided with these social and political differences in the American population. What's the party identification according to social group? And so what I want you to kind of do is to keep your eye on this middle bar. You'll notice that the middle bar is independents, the red bar are Republicans, and the blue bar are Democrats. And this is as of February 2016. So within the last year, what is this party identification? What are these party identification numbers? Again, from the Pew Research Center. So across gender, men are more likely to be independents than are women. But across age, older Americans, and it's sort of a bit of a straight relationship. Older Americans are likely to be more partisan than younger Americans, and among older Americans you can split party identification by a third Republican, nearly a third are independent, and a third are Democratic. By race, there are some distinctions that we've talked about before. Among whites, you have a sort of roughly a third that are, or a little less than a third that are Republican, about a quarter that are Democrats, and the solid middle being independents. Much less true for African Americans. Solidly more Democratic versus Hispanics, solidly more Democratic. Asian Americans, roughly split, but split not between Republican and Democrat, but between independent and Democrat. By education, it's interesting because in some respects, education really does not, you don't see sort of a strict divide across educational levels. These numbers are relatively the same, are they not? Except for, maybe a little bit more toward postgraduate being more Democratic. That's true, but when you look at college graduates, some college graduate or high school, for the most part, folk evenly divide or divide among the same pattern. Pardon me, same pattern. And then income, the more income you have, the a little more conservative, or the more conservative you are, right? From 17% conservative, or the more no, let me revise it. I'm sorry. That those of lower income are likely to be a little less Republican, more solidly independent and Democratic. But when you come to those with making higher levels of income, it's nearly an even split between Democrat and Republican, but independent is still solidly in the middle. Okay. So the U.S., as you know, has a two-party system, and it has roughly been this way since 1976, although it's not the same two parties, as we'll talk about shortly in the next lecture. The third parties have often made the two major parties more accountable, but tradition in our single-member district system has limited their ballot access. So there's a range of third parties in the United States outside the two main parties, and at least since 1856, 1854, those two main parties have been the Democrats and the Republicans. That system has remained in place for more than, more than 150 years. But we are at that point where we can talk about the ways in which third parties have also played this critical role in pushing the main parties, getting issues on the ballot, even though they don't succeed or they have a difficult time getting their candidates elected to office because of the dominance of the two main parties. But there's a range of these parties. The National Republican Party that had a very short life in 1824. The Free Soil Party in 1858 that merged with the Republican Party, and the Free Soil Party being a party that essentially wanted to argue against slavery, free meaning soil free of slave labor, or the Populist Party that was a party backed by working class and agrarian farmer interest. The Socialist Party, a leftist party that argued for broad social welfare reform and a sort of checks upon capitalism. And then the States' Rights Party of 1948, the States' Rights Party being that party led in part by Strom Thurmond, arguing that the states have the rights to determine their own civil rights policy. Or the Reform Party of 1995, and in part the Reform Party emerging out of the efforts of Ross Perot and arguing for a more sort of middle to conservative party but was between the Republicans and Democrats, trying to provide common sense reforms. Or the Green Party, that's argued in 1984 and 1996, has argued strongly for the environment and for a sort of social democratic reform in the environment. And now, there are ways in which American political parties are organized. It's important, when I speak about their organization, to also talk about the process of nomination, of how are candidates nominated to office. And I want you to go back and review that graphic within Chapter 12, nomination being a critical process, because nomination is the process by which candidates are officially given the authorization to run under a party label. You're officially authorized to run under a party label. That's the process of nomination. And there are various ways individuals are nominated, but your authors talk about the traditional path and the primary path. Go back and review those graphics and those definitions for this section. But this graphic is showing, this 12.4 figure is showing the organization of the national parties. And there's sort of a parallel structure between the state conventions and this is the part we know most about. We know most about sort of the national convention because it's displayed on TV, a significant moment in mid to late summer where the parties gather together and the nominees make very important, very public speeches to millions of people. So we know about this process most, and that stems from party voters and activists in primary elections and caucuses, leading up to local conventions and caucuses, whether it's at the local or district or precinct level. Then they have state conventions, and these state conventions lead to national conventions, where individuals delegates are come up through this process as part of the national convention and are cast votes for the nominees of the party. But then the local party structure is also important. There are local committees that link to state committees that are part of the national committee. So there's the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and the RNC, the Republican National Committee. Those are the organizations that actually run the party. The convention is an event and an important gathering for the party, but the national committees actually run the party. All right, so the RNC chair is the chair or the chief executive officer of the RNC. The DNC chair is the chair or the chief executive officer. I might not have an exact title in terms of CEO, but the individual who's at the head of the party in that respect. And so here's that graphic I want you to review with regards to the nomination process, the traditional route, the primary route, the independent route. Results are reported to the County Board of Elections and the Secretary of State. But the declaration for the party's support, informal designation, is the result of following among party members and delegates. So the traditional route is you build a basis of support among various delegates in an informal way. Then you come to the convention or caucus and delegates vote for candidates or the party. And this is the go out and sort of convince folks who are the party delegates that you want to be nominated or as nominated and win the nomination for the party. But the more primary route is sort of the formal route, formal designation, a petition that you file a petition with a minimum number of signatures is provided by law, and these pathways can vary by state, but you have to petition to become a nominee of the party. Then there's a primary election, and roll voters choose by secret ballot among 2 or more designated candidates, and thus you then get onto a ballot that way. And then the sort of independent route outside of the 2 main parties is self-declaration or support by a small independent party. That independent party, then a petition is filed with a minimum number of signatures is provided by law to get your name on the ballot, and you're placed upon the ballot. Okay. All right, now let's turn to the responsible party model. And the responsible party model is a framework that was provided by President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was not only a professor at Princeton University, but he was a professor at Princeton University by virtue of the fact that he was a political scientist. He was among those who were early in the discipline of political science, claiming it and shaping it as a discipline. And he also was a politician. And there's much that can be said about President Woodrow Wilson's term of office. But let me emphasize the model he provided as a political scientist about how do we know that parties are functioning in responsible ways in a democratic society. So he says that we know that they're functioning responsibly if the parties aggregate and articulate interest. What is to aggregate? To bring together, in other words, to solve the collective action problem, to bring together, to unite. And once you bring together to unite, you then articulate, you formulate a platform, you formulate policy stances that stand on behalf of the party. So that's certainly 2 functions that parties must do if they are responsible, or let's say not just responsible, but useful political parties. Then parties form governments and they ensure the system's accountability. Now, to form a government in a presidential system means that you are the party in power. In a parliamentary system, to form a government is to have the head of state, we'll get to that later and when we talk about the president, but to have the head of state, so in Great Britain, it's the Queen, who makes a formal invitation to a leader of a party in parliament that seems to be the dominant party. She invites that party to form a government to try and bring about a coalition that can actually govern by way of that it has a dominant number of votes in parliament. But in the United States, it's easy to form a government because whoever gets the majority of votes in the House of Representatives are those who govern the House of Representatives. The majority in the Senate govern the Senate. To some respect, we'll break that down a little bit more. But they are the leaders. It's a formal title of leader of the Senate, or the majority leader, I should say, of the Senate. So in each of those instances, that is the formation of government. But then you have to ensure some level of accountability within the system. So that's also, the accountability function might also come from the opposition parties, from the minority parties that say, we won't go along, or we're going to push back, or we oppose. Or if you need any of our votes on this side to pass your legislation, you have to modify the legislation to bring about an accountability to the interests we represent. So that's both the majority and the minority way in which systems of parties form government and provide accountability. Then parties provide political stability. The Democratic label, now the Democratic label, the Republican label, you can see from my previous slides that they've changed over time. But at least within a time span, they are consistent. And since they've been the main party since roughly the 1850s, clearly there's ways in which people understand these labels. And understanding these labels, these brands, bring about some degree of political stability, that you don't have to say, well, who exactly is the groups that are arguing for what we should do? The political parties have the strong identification, or at least we have a strong understanding of the identification they provide, and that provides some stability within the system itself. Parties nominate candidates and mobilize voters to elect them. We've just talked about the nomination process very briefly, but that nomination process is critical. Who is given the okay, the authorization from the party to be the party standard bearer, to be their candidates. That's what I mean by authorization, to be their candidates. And then how do the parties mobilize, get people out to vote, register people to vote, get interest groups that are aligned with the parties to get people to vote? Those are the things that parties need to do. So those are the functions of political parties in a responsible party model, if parties are doing what they should do. This graphic I know is, let me go back. This graphic I know is a new graphic, but it's actually not a new concept. I'm going to stop touching the mouse. It's not a new concept. It's not a new concept in the sense that this really is another representation of the median voter theorem. The top graphic represents the party in the general electorate. So, or what's the general electorate look like from liberal to moderate to conservative? And where are the positions of various candidates who are trying to capture the vote within the general electorate? So on the left, on that green line is where the Democratic position will be, and the fact that they're trying to move toward the center as a Democratic candidate to capture as much of the curve as they can under their area. And then the Republicans are moving to the right, or excuse me, I'm sorry, let me say that again. The Democrats are moving to the right, in order to capture as much as they can of moderates and liberals to create a coalition. And the Republican candidate is trying to move toward the left to capture as much of moderates and conservatives to create a coalition. So in under normal considerations, the general electorate or general election model has the Democratic candidate moving to the right, the Republican candidate moving to the left, and that represents sort of the one aspect, or that represents the dynamics that occur in creating a coalition to elect candidates in that model and under those considerations. The bottom is what we call that median voter theorem, and in the sense that let me restate that. It represents the way in which we think about the voter choice relative to political primaries, right? So you have the pull toward extremism in each case. The Democratic Party activists and elites moving toward the left to capture as much as they can of the distribution of votes on the liberal side. The Republican Party candidate and activists and elites moving toward the right to capture as much of the Conservative Party electorate. Now, how they represent median voter, because there's a different median voter in each of these instances, right? And so this is a fine distinction I want to give you, is that if you look at the top of the curve, the middle of the curve for each distribution is in different places given the nature of the election, okay? So that's how the median voter theorem might broadly relate. It might broadly relate in each instance. I didn't want to confuse you in our last lecture because I know you only had one specific graphic, and so I wanted to say how that graphic applies to either the primary or the general election. But now that you have sort of these two graphics, you can kind of see how that's a evolution of the concept to talk about median voter if the median voter is in different places. All right, we can unpack that a bit more, but this is just an extension of that previous discussion. Now, does a responsible party model work? Because there's some problems we have. First of all, American political parties might be weakening. What do we mean by that they're weakening? Our elections are increasingly more candidate-centered. In other words, it's not the political party made up of party bosses, made up of party patronage, that in effect dictate who will be nominated as the party. Remember I talked about the progressive reforms of the of the turn of the century between the late 1800s into the 1900s, and from the 19th to the 20th century. And you had, at that time, political party bosses in control of the party machines, of political parties, who would dictate in broad respect who would become the nominee of the party. They controlled the party from a top-down perspective. But given various levels of reform, parties have less of a control over their own nominees. And so people can spring up and run as nominees and be successful. In some respects, you could argue that President Donald Trump was such a candidate, that there was strong opposition to Trump's nomination within the Republican Party. To a lesser degree, that was also true of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election, and to some small degree, it was also true of Barack Obama. Barack Obama challenged Hillary Clinton in 2008. So, because you have more candidate-centered, it's not the machine from a top-down perspective or the party from a top-down perspective that can dictate who is the political party nominee. And so the candidates who are successful can spring up and control parties and get the nomination of the party. Parties have less control over the party nomination process and over political patronage than they did under political machines. What's political patronage? President Andrew Jackson in the 1820s famously said, "To the victor goes the spoils." What did he mean by that? He says, well, whoever wins office, they're the ones who gets the goodies. They're the one who can dole out the benefits of handing out offices, handing out political favors, because they were the individuals who are now in control in the halls of government. Well, that's less true now, certainly less true now than it was true in Andrew Jackson's day, because we have civil service reform. We have more ways in which in order to get a government office, you have to go through a professionalization process, a process where we have to determine, in fact, you are qualified, not just simply you are a candidate, a supporter of the winning candidate who gets the benefit or the spoil from them now returning a political favor. I'll make a distinction between political offices or political appointees versus civil service offices or civil service positions when we talk about the presidency and the bureaucracy. But there's much fewer of those political offices now. And so political machines, top-down control of parties, even though we talk about party establishment, there's less of that now than was true certainly 100 years ago, and certainly less of it even than 60 years ago. Then the American public's attention or attachment to the major political parties has lessened, though the vote may say differently. So notice that independents are sort of the dominant party in the United States, that is those who are not affiliated or say they're affiliated with either party are the highest sort of quote-unquote party identifiers, or the non-party identifiers in the United States. That's interesting because these attachments to parties have lessened. At the same time, independents do vote. They're less likely to vote, but they do vote, and they may lean toward one party or the other. They may lean a little bit more toward the Democrats. They may lean a little bit more toward the Republicans. So they do vote, even though they are now the dominant party that aren't attached to either of the major parties. And political parties are mobilizing voters in large numbers and are more clearly ideologically, or more clearly ideological, or as I say here, are more ideologically clear. So their brands are clearer. The brand of the Democratic Party was muddy in the late 1950s because you had Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats, and the Northern Democrats were liberal on civil rights and economic policy, whereas the Southern Democrats would have been conservative on civil rights policy, but might have been moderate to slightly liberal on economic policy. So you had this muddying of, well, where exactly do the Democrats stand? Now there's a clear identification on racial, social, and economic policy in both parties. Democrats are more consistently liberal, Republicans more consistently conservative. What are some of the criticisms of the responsible party model? Well, first of all, the responsible party model, the two-party system restricts voter choice. So to say that it can hold the two-party system will provide for accountability is a little difficult because you only have two options. If you don't like either option, the third parties are an option, but are they an effective option? Do you cast in that choice for the third party mean that you cast a meaningful vote for a candidate who will be elected? Now, let me be clear. I'm not arguing against third parties. In fact, I think third parties play a critically important function in our system. The problem is just utility or practicality sometimes. You know, the argument that, well, I'm going to vote for this third party as opposed to the main party candidates. Well, that's meaningful, but it may not mean that you're casting a vote for a candidate who will actually win. And that's the sort of difficult choice we put voters in not having a more robust party system. So the responsible party model doesn't kind of work or can't hold for increased greater accountability. Parties are too insulated. Parties are parties responsible to change in some ways. Is big money in parties mean that it crowds out the voices of ordinary Americans? And so the degree to which campaign finance reform has or has not taken place at state, local, and national levels matters. There's more money in politics. There's more money for the political parties. There's more moneyed interest or big moneyed interest for the political parties to pay attention to. So does that make it difficult for the parties to be responsible? Is it parties are too focused on winning to develop solutions to long-term problems? So a perfect example is the problem of the national debt. On one side, and you can call out the hypocrisy, and I'll use the word, I know it's a strong word, but I'll use the word right now, the hypocrisy of both the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to certain items. So I'm just going to point out one particular example with regards to the national debt. When Barack Obama was president, arguably the Democratic Party, those who were Democratic leaders in Congress, were not quite as concerned about the national debt when in 2009, when President Barack Obama passed a multi-billion-dollar stimulus package. Republicans were howling about the national debt, about it's going to bankrupt us. We're selling away our children's fortune, yada, yada, yada. Now we're here in 2017, and the Republicans have passed are trying to pass, I should say, a tax reform bill, a massive tax reform bill, upwards of nearly $2 trillion tax reform. But the Democrats are saying, you're going to bankrupt us. That money's going toward, it is going toward the rich. It is not going toward the middle class. And Republicans are saying, well, even though the national debt might increase, it certainly might increase, this will stimulate growth. Well, in each instance, the parties are a little bit hypocritical. In a sense, you can discern who's more hypocritical than the other party. That's up to you. But in each case, the parties want to pass their agenda, and so you might slightly switch your opinion based upon do you support the president who's in power or not support the president who's in power. Is your party in the majority? Is your party not in the majority in the legislature? So a long-term solution is more difficult because of this back and forth, and this back and forth is structured in the partisan divides, the polarization that we have. So the responsible party model can't speak to that as well. And then parties are too weak. As I said in the previous graphic, parties don't control the nomination process. They really don't. You had 19 or however many candidates who were running in the 2016 election on the Republican side. I mean, a wide number of candidates, a wide number of options. A lot of people sprung up, and so, that was a sort of rough and tumble process. Some would say that was healthy, certainly, but it also meant that the party was in great flux as to exactly who would be its nominee. And that interest groups can also mobilize. Certainly this was true for Bernie Sanders and the various young people and various other groups that got behind Sanders' campaign relative to Clinton. So parties don't control this nomination process as much as they used to. And if you don't control who becomes your nominee, you really can't control a central function of a political party. All right, so here's the terms I want you to keep in mind. Political party, party in government, party in the electorate, party identification, nomination, open primary, closed primary. Go to your book to see those distinctions. An open primary is a primary where you can vote for a candidate irrespective of whether you are the party of that candidate. So Democrats could vote to determine who would become the Republican Party nominee. A Republican could vote to determine who would be the Democratic Party nominee of a certain office. Closed primary means you have to be a member of that party to vote for that party's candidates. Only Republicans will vote in the Republican primary. Only Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary. Caucus varies from primaries in that a caucus is a way, and particularly done famously in Iowa as one example, where you don't have voters going to the polls just like an election, but you have people gathering in places and creating caucuses to determine in their caucus how will they vote collectively. So people gather in a town hall function to determine exactly how they'll sort out who will be nominated by this one specific gathering that then links to the broader caucus. Okay, a little more messier, muddier, but certainly democratic process. Whoever shows up, is the person who's casting a vote in that respect. We've already talked about the responsible party model, and we also talked about the party activists. What is political polarization? Is it increasingly becoming a problem in government and in the electorate? Why or why not? What are the functions of political parties? Distinguish between the party and government and the party and the electorate. What is the role of party activists? Explain the reasons why fewer Americans may be identifying with political parties as the parties have become more consistent. Does this mean parties are weakening? Explain the dilemma candidates face running in a typical political primary versus a general election. Go back to the median voter theorem. What is the responsible party model? What are its strengths and its weaknesses? All right, so this has been a lecture by Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for POLI 201, American National Government. All rights reserved for the intellectual property of this lecture. Thank you very much.